Test. 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 It's working. Test.
Okay, I'll trust you. Wait, like, oh, my thing's not on. Let me just go.
Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're reaching us from. I think I'd like to start by apologizing for the slight delay in starting this program. I think many of you know, those that have had opportunities to attend COP, that you know, it gets really, really busy, and it's quite challenging to get the most exciting and you know, interesting views on what's going on, particularly when you've got negotiators participating in your program. And so just a few quick announcements for those that are attending the session in person. Please just nod if you can hear me. And secondly, when the session is done, just please leave the headphones and the gadgets by the table to your extreme left. And once again, welcome everyone to this session on Article 21C, evidence-based solutions for supporting pathways to low emissions and climate resilient development session. My name is Samson Bewe, and I come from an organization, or work for an organization called South North. We are based in Cape Town, South Africa, and we do, you know, quite a lot of work, you know, around climate change, and in particular, issues around climate finance, climate science, the broad spectrum of energy and key sustainable development issues, and more importantly, knowledge brokering. And so recently, we received funding from the German government through the International Climate Initiative to implement a project focusing on Article 21C of the Paris Agreement in Africa. And this project is also being supported by the Ethiopian Ministry of Finance. It's also being supported by the South African Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and it's also being supported by the African group of negotiators. And so, just a second, we're having some technological challenges with the slides here. But anyway, while we're still addressing the technological challenges, Article 21C of the Paris Agreement is very important. Is very important. I beg your pardon. So, Okay, great. I think we're back online now. Yeah, it's been quite the day, and everyone is just a bit, overworked, and it's only like midday here. But anyway, just to continue with the discussion, I think perhaps before I dive into the mechanics of what we are to talk about today, um, I'd like to sort of introduce our panelists today who have been so fortunate to join us to also contribute to what we're about to, embark on today in talking about Article 2.1c in Africa. And of course, as the camera will drift towards them a little later on, I would like to introduce David Reifisch, who's the team leader for the International Climate Policy at German Watch. And I would also like to introduce Pa Usman George, who's the Director of Country Programming from the Green Climate Fund. And so overall today, what we plan to achieve is, first of all, we'll provide an overview of the project that we are embarking on, just to give you an idea of what we are seeking to achieve in terms of Article 2.1c in Africa. And then we'll have a succinct, panel discussion just to touch on a number of key burning issues around Article 2.1c, in Africa, and to solicit some views and opinions from the experts such as David and Papa Usman. And then we'll open up the floor for some questions. And so just to provide some context around the project that we are implementing, Article 2.1c, of course, quite clearly, indicates the global goal, for countries to make their financial flows consistent with low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. Now, the challenge is that Article 2.1c within the Paris Agreement appears to be vague and does not have adequate guidance on how you begin to not only conceptualize, but operationalize Article 2.1c, not only across geography space, but also across varying country circumstances. And I think Africa presents a very interesting case in the sense that a number of countries rely quite strongly on fossil fuels, and much of their budget and fiscal spending is driven by the extraction and exploitation of carbon assets. And now the question becomes, a full implementation of Article 2.1c poses some very significant challenges. And of course, we've seen from the recent IPCC report, the science is quite clear that we need to transition to low emission and climate resilient development. But fundamentally, the case on how to do so for Africa remains complex, or at least unclear. So in this project, what we are trying to do is effectively establish an evidence base on how we begin to think about operationalizing Article 2.1c in Africa. And so the question here becomes, how do you operationalize Article 2.1c in Africa without resulting in an abrupt evaluation of asset classes that would constitute a systemic risk and in turn hinder the development towards realizing the sustainable development goals, of course, up to a point that we are at now, right? So this becomes very important. And I think we've seen a lot of work going on around the world, in trying to understand how we operationalize Article 2.1c. And in this particular work, what we are trying to do is think about how we develop a coordinated approach for operationalizing Article 2.1c in Africa by looking at different sets and sources of finance, and to think about more rationally, how do we align these with Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement. And more importantly, we'll begin to look at how do we think about aligning financial flows heavily invested in carbon assets. And it's a very good example here is South Africa. And David will touch a little bit on that to just reflect on, this discussion. There's also need to begin to think about more critically, how do we begin to align financial flows in countries with recent discoveries of mineral assets? And these are very important conversations that need to be had. I mean, there are also conversations around the need to align financial flows in infrastructure. How do we think about that? And I think these are very pertinent questions that warrant a more extensive discussion, and ideally a more focused approach on Africa, taking into account its pre-existing social economic dynamics and evolution of growth over time. And so the overall focus of this project is essentially to establish the evidence base. And I think this is important because a lot of the discussion that's going on around the world seems to posit the theory, that operationalizing Article 21C is a very general and broad goal, which is essentially not the case. I think there is need to sort of establish and lay down, more specific levers around how you align financial flows. And I think this is very important in thinking about the nature and the sources of financial flows. There's a need to develop more robust understanding around, the levers that will support public as well as private financial flows, levers that will support both domestic and international financial flows. And the aim here is to ensure that whatever the goal is, and how we think about aligning financial flows, we do it in a way that supports development and the pathway to low emissions and climate resilient development. And more importantly, the outcome of which should be the presentation of ambitious NDC targets, right? And so we plan to achieve this by first of all, developing a systematic assessment of potential volumes and sources of financial flows that warranty an alignment with the Paris Agreement, and in turn, take steps to understand the relevant climate risks and investment risks that are tied to the African infrastructure gap. And we also plan to look at, identify and analyze key sectoral prospects for the reinvestment of these financial flows. And I think this entails the key transition from high carbon investments to sort of a low carbon pathway. And we also plan to establish some key recommendations on how countries and governments should begin to think about Article 21C. So what we've done in principle is develop 4 key clusters that we think require or warranty substantive investigation in Africa. And so the key target countries here are South Africa, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and more broadly, the African region. And so in South Africa, we plan to look at the role of financial services, and in particular asset managers, fund managers, development finance institutions, in creating opportunities to align financial flows. And what we plan to also do is augment this analysis by looking at countries with similar characteristics, in this particular case, Algeria, Angola, Botswana, Egypt, and the like. And the second cluster we plan to look at is populations without access to clean and affordable energy. And I think this very much speaks to safeguarding the assets of the poor. And we recognize quite strongly that access to energy remains a key challenge in Africa. And there's growing energy inequality, and there is a need to realign financial flows within the energy sector by establishing more robust business models, and putting in place measures and enabling conditions to not only increase climate finance towards energy, but also to mobilize and leverage other sources of finance, be it grant financing as well as private capital. And we also plan to look at a third cluster that is of interest, given what recently we witnessed with South Africa, where there is a deal in place to support the transition from a high carbon to a low carbon economy. And this is particularly interesting for countries such as Mozambique that recently discovered high carbon assets. So there's a need to warrant an investigation of what does the pathway look like for a country like Mozambique. I mean, the question becomes is, how does Mozambique transition to a low carbon pathway? Would Mozambique pursue more of a managed transition? This remains the question, because many of these countries still rely on the capitalization of carbon assets to finance their fiscal spending and to maintain the balance of payments. The fourth cluster will look at a more regional approach around how we begin to think about aligning financial flows around infrastructure spending. I think this is particularly important with a lot of investment trends that we've seen in Africa, particularly growing infrastructure investment by, from the Chinese, as well as, big infrastructure spending emerging from development finance institutions, extending, credit and grants to African countries. And so with this in mind, I will step over to the other side of the room to open up a discussion with Pa Usman and David to just critically just jump into what are some of the key things that we need to look out for, or at least take into account when trying to understand Article 2.1 in the context of Africa. Thank you. So once again, Pa Usman, thank you for joining this session. David, great to have you here, and looking forward to having this discussion with you. I think I'll start with you, David, and I'd like you to, I think it would be great for our audience for you to just shed some light around the key conceptualization of Article 2.1c, the challenges and the opportunities around it, and more importantly, just to give us a sense of who are some of the key actors, in operationalizing Article 2.1c, and how we begin to think about shifting financial flows, and more importantly, what are some of the key discussions that are emerging from the negotiations around the transition to low carbon pathways?
Thank you very much, Samson. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and I think it's amazing the work you'll be doing as part of the project. Very timely and certainly important. With regard to your question, I think first of all, it's important to understand that in order to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, we'll need trillions in investment, trillions really, and we know that the public coffins do not provide for these trillions. They will play an important role, but they cannot provide the whole finance in order for the investments that are needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So with that, I'm already talking about two essential groups in achieving 2.1c. It's the public and the private. On the private, it is that the private sector, the financial sector especially, for the longest time had challenges in identifying the risks that are associated with climate change. The climate risks, on the one hand, the physical risks that come from the impacts of climate change, but also the transition risks. And that is something that you alluded to, and that's, I think, particularly important also for the African case, is if we have a sudden change in policy, and then through that, the value and assets all of a sudden drop and become stranded. It's the terminology often used for that, stranded assets. So, but what we're observing now, nonetheless, is that the financial sector is starting to bring an additional dynamic when it comes to achieving the Paris Agreement. We're starting to see financial flows shift already, and that is a big factor also for countries like those in Africa and the different parts of Africa. If we look at the transition and the finance that is needed for the energy transition, while improving energy access in Africa, while guaranteeing the development that is needed, right? I will come to that more in a second. On the public side, we have two main elements. We have the elements of domestically, the finance ministry essentially deciding to a certain degree how the taxpayers' money is used. Is it used for fossil fuel subsidies, or is it used for renewable energy subsidies? What kind of tax breaks it is used? Public procurement. So lots of possibilities for the public sector to affect also the financial flows domestically. And then we have the international level of public finance. And we heard, for example, today the announcement that 25 countries and financial institutions will stop financing oil and gas internationally, after the announcement we had of the G20 already last week that they will stop financing international coal finance. So we have the international level of financing that is public for fossil fuels, and that is moving away. that is moving away. So that these are different factors that you can already see that the financial flows are shifting. How is that particularly relevant for the African context? As you have alluded to already, African countries, there are several African countries that depend on fossil fuels, being it the exploitation, being it for the use of energy or even export. And through that comes royalties that are necessary for public budgets. There is employment, obviously, and that makes it a difficult question for African countries what you do in terms of this financial flow shifting, especially because we already see that certain private investors, because they do not want to invest in economies anymore where there's a high share of fossil energy in the mix, that they prefer not to invest. But we need these investments for the energy transition in the countries. So what we need then is we need essentially the public sector to step in internationally as well, to finance the transition and to support that, and the just transition especially. And there, I think South Africa is a brilliant example that we had this week, which I really want to emphasize here. The Just Energy Transition Partnership that was launched by Germany, amongst other donors, with South Africa, where 8.5 billion will flow to South Africa for the energy, the just energy transition. And that is the support that is needed, especially also for the African context, to ensure that African countries will not seek the same pathway that the industrialized countries have sought in the past by using fossil fuels. One last point, and I hand over to you again. Those countries that have not exploited their natural resources yet, in our view, they should not do that. Because if we are serious about the 1.5 degrees, those will become stranded assets. This will mean countries assume debt, additional debt, and some of them already debt distressed, to develop these fossil fuels, the exploitation of them, and risk that in 15, 20 years, they get stranded and there's a heavy weight domestically through these investments. So those countries who have not exploited them should, from the beginning, focus on renewable energy rather than on the fossil fuel exploitation. I leave it like that. I think the negotiation part I leave for a second round. Thank you, Sam.
Great. Thanks, David. I think that was very, very insightful. And I think which leads me to my next question, which I'm about to pose to Pa Usman. I think I'll just pick up from where David left off, from particularly around, the recent pronouncement that, some financial institutions will not be financing oil and gas. And I think this becomes very, very interesting in thinking about the financial ecosystem. And perhaps my question to you, Pa Usman, would be, what is the role of, financial services sector, in particular asset managers, fund managers and development finance institutions, in creating opportunities for, aligning financial flows or transitioning from, high carbon intensive development to low carbon pathways?
Thank you very much, Samson, for this question. This is quite important. As David mentioned earlier on, the financial institutions and some of these institutions play a very important role, and they are managing assets in the tune of trillions of dollars. So I think they need to continue supporting the low carbon development pathway, creating enabling environments. And one of the things that the GCF does in terms of helping de-risking in some of these investments is to go through guarantees and equities, where we take the first loss in terms of guarantees to enable some of these financial institutions to have the appetite to take the risk. And then if there's any loss, we incur the loss and with respect to the climate transition. And you could recall that we have several projects that were approved including the Coral Reef project, that where we are really taking the first loss, and we are investing almost 300 million US dollars to really give some of these financial institutions the opportunity to invest in these risky areas. So this is something that we are doing. We have the risk appetite. We have various instruments in addition to the loans and grants. We go into guarantees, equity. So I think countries need to use these opportunities, and we can easily work with some of these investment institutions and even the capital investment, including the pension funds. And we have trillions of dollars that are being managed by the pension funds, and I think we need to engage them and create the enabling environment for them.
Thanks, Pa Usman. I think, yeah, this is also very, very interesting that you mentioned, the role of pension funds. And I think, there is essentially a huge role for pension funds and sovereign wealth funds. And we're thinking about how we align financial flows. And I think, especially when you think about, for instance, sovereign wealth funds that are very much capitalized on, fossil fuels, I think there's definitely a role in that. And perhaps what I'm picking up from this discussion is that there is need to create an enabling environment. And I think there is need to quite clearly, distill between the different sources of finance. And in this particular case, we need to understand how do we create the enabling environment for public finance and private capital, because these two sources of finance respond to different motives. Public finance quite dominantly responds to maximizing social welfare, whereas private capital, I mean, in its simple terms, responds to maximizing profit. And of course, we've seen slight changes, over time in terms of private capital, beginning to account for climate risk. But perhaps maybe it's also a question, for the government to. Because I think, government needs to take a lead in creating the enabling environment and to promote accountability. And the question becomes, if you think about private sector, and in some cases, perhaps most cases, they respond very well to regulation. And of course, it is important as well to also understand what government does, whether it incentivizes or disincentivizes, private sector financial flows. With that in mind, I think I'll just pass on to you, David, to just give us a sense of what are the ongoing discussions in the negotiations around Article 2.1c. And I think one of the key challenges around Article 2.1c is the fact that there is a lack of a standard definition, and there is lack of a common understanding of Article 2.1c, which leaves a number of countries to interpret or structure Article 2.1c in a way that fits one particular country. But the key issue with that becomes, at the end of the day, how a country is able to show transparency and at the same time scrutinize and track whether financial flows are really aligned with Article 2.1c or low carbon pathways.
Thank you, Samson. Allow me to get 2 points before that, because you said a lot about enabling environments. I think there's a lot of value in what you just said, and I would like to add to that. First, role of pension funds, very important because they're institutional investors. They have long-term horizons. They have the capacity to invest in big infrastructure projects where the payout takes a while. So they can play an important role in that transition. On the enabling environments, for me, there's a triangular of three factors. One factor, the government needs to create the three factors contribute to investment security for the private sector. On top, there is the regulation through clear targets from the government. For example, South Africa now moving the NDC onto its most ambitious level, like we roughly get, I think, at a 1.7 degree compatibility. That clear target gives investment security. Second, instruments to internalize the externalities. For example, carbon pricing. There might be other instruments, but that would be a classic. And third element, for the financial sector to know where to invest, it needs data. And so the third element is disclosure. We need to help disclose more information, more quality of data, comparable data, so that the financial sector knows, okay, these type of companies are on a path, on a transition path, and it's worthwhile investing, while those are clearly falling in behind because they're not moving. And so they can be secure in their investment choice. That I want to say on the enabling environment. With regard to negotiation, a very different space, yet related. Article 2 on C obviously has a long history. It's the important thing. It's one of the 3 long-term goals. So it's the 3 goals of Paris Agreement. In Paris, it became it came together as part of several elements that bit by bit came together. But through that, there was long caution about the implications of Article 2.1c and what it means. So you're absolutely right if you say there's still the challenge that there's no common understanding of what Article 2.1c means exactly, because there are questions about like the pathway, because it says development pathways. What are pathways for different countries? And the second point is, and I think that's why your project is also so valuable, about evidence-based solutions, because we still do not have the tracked enough information about where the financial flows are heading. So actually, we have the mapping as part of the Standing Committee on Finance, but we do not have a tracking of the progress of the data, actually. So what we think, what is important, Article 2.1c and the connection to Article 9, because Article 9 is the obligation of the developed countries to provide support to developing countries. You cannot intermingle that. Like the obligation of developed countries stands. Like developed countries will need to support developing countries going forward. There is a common connection in a way that Article 2.1c practically says that all the support that is provided needs to be aligned with the Paris Agreement, with the pathways, so that climate finance cannot be, for example, clean coal or gas anymore, because that would not be aligned. One thing that we are worried about, and that is a question that will be relevant to my colleague here from Pa Usman from the GCF. We saw the debate about the Development Bank of Southern Africa in the last GCF board meeting. And the thing is that in our view, Article 2.1c cannot obstruct the access, the direct access from entities from Africa, for example, to funding, to public funding. 2.1c should help, and the GCF, for example, like institutions should help development banks like the Development Bank of Southern Africa to, over time, hopefully very quickly, to align with the Paris Agreement, but it cannot be all of a sudden be a stop to direct access financing, because we need these players like Development Bank of Southern Africa to be able to finance the transition in the respective countries. So I think that gives a little bit of the picture of a complexity that we have in the negotiations around the issue of Article 2.1c, vis-a-vis Article 9 as well, but also as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks, David. I think, yeah, that was quite a lot of exciting and interesting points. And you spoke about, I think more importantly, you talked about disclosure. And I think this is very, very interesting from a financial standpoint. And I think data is one of the most precious things right now. And I think there is a lack of data, and there is need to provide and to develop systems and processes to be able to capture data and, quite clearly capture both climate and investment risks, right, as they relate to micro and macro prudential issues, right? And I think you talked about something very interesting, and around that I will sort of redirect to Pa Usman around the need to have institutions like the GCF support regional finance institutions and development finance institutions in, developing a more clear understanding around Article 2(1)(c). Perhaps I'll pass on to Pa Usman just to get some reflection on you on that.
Thank you very much, Samson. And I think David is right in terms of enabling environment. This is something that we support through grant financing for countries to develop the enabling environment through policies, regulations, and systems. So data collection, data is also part of that through our readiness preparatory support program. Now, with respect to supporting direct access entities, I think that is very key. It's part of the key principles of country ownership, so that resources flow through direct access entities. And the unfortunate issue around DBSA, I think, was as a result of disagreement between board members, but we hope this is an issue that would be resolved soon. But this is not going to affect the current portfolio of DBSA, the projects that are under implementation. They are under a separate legal agreement, so those projects will be implemented. And we are optimistic that before the master agreement that we have between the GCF and DBSA in terms of the accreditation master agreement, before it lapses next year, the board would be in a position to resolve this, to avoid any gap between the first and the second phase of the accreditation process.
Yeah, thanks, Pa Usman. That was very, very insightful. Perhaps, David, just around, the last set of comments from you, if any, before we open up the floor for questions. Any final comments? Great. Thank you very much for a very insightful discussion, and we'll open up the floor for any questions from the public.
Good afternoon. My name is Tafara, and I'm from Zimbabwe. So just hearing you speaking about an enabling environment. So I'm coming from a legal background. So there's a case which is within the courts of the city of Cape Town versus the energy regulator and the Minister of Energy, where Cape Town wants to buy electricity from independent power producers. And that has been stalled indefinitely, citing that it's a governmental issue. So is this not the hurdles that we could face or see when it comes to the just transition? This is apart from saying it takes away jobs or everything, but these are independent power producers already on the ground, really producing electricity, but then we don't see what's going on. And in this case, would that not stall this milestone that we want to see when it comes to the enabling environment? Thank you.
Great. Thank you for the question. Does anyone want to take this on? David, would you like to kick it off?
Well, I have to say I can only provide a German example here, which is obviously every case will be particular. But in Germany, because we, similar to South Africa, we have a high coal dependence in our energy mix, and we still have it. We have managed to come to a coal phase out date, and that came through a commission. And part of that is actually that certain amounts are being paid to the energy providers as a payoff for accepting that the coal power plants will be taken off grid earlier than expected. So essentially, I think there can be options to find ways to solve this, but you are in essence right. We will see these legal cases, and we will see legal cases where those who are dependent on, for example, energy provision through fossil fuels, to try to hold grab of what they have. And the way we move more to earlier transitions, there are these obligations to buy energy from certain providers. There are likely going to be more like these legal cases, and there will need to be we will need to find ways around that to still accelerate the energy transition. But thank you for bringing up that case. Certainly super interesting. Thank you.
No, thank you. I think, I mean, I don't want to go into the negotiations, but I know that as part of the negotiations, the issue of response measures comes to mind, because when you have this kind of policies that affect these issues, then there was a call for compensations with response to this. But again, I think what needs to happen is really designing and developing very clear regulatory, very strong regulatory frameworks that would sort of avoid ambiguity. But there is also a need for a lot of awareness raising as countries move towards this transition, so that the industry would also know the potential negative consequences of the policies that are being put in place in the coming years. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, David and Pa Usman. I think those were very, very insightful responses. And just to add my 2 cents to this, and look, it's certainly very important that, you know, the transition sort of needs to be smooth to some extent. But at the same time, I think it's in just breaking it down a little bit, when you think about in the case of South Africa, more broadly, the transition is, you know, if you look at, you know, the power structure in South Africa, very much driven by, you know, power generation from coal. And so the key discussion around the transition is mainly around shifting from, you know, generating electricity with coal to renewable energy. And then when you go down to the sort of the lower level, when you look at the power market, the power sector, I think it gets a little bit more complex, in that it's South Africa still, you know, assumes a power market that's somewhat vertically integrated. And of course, there have been a whole lot of discussions around how do we begin to bring in a private sector to play a part in, you know, the key power, you know, power supply value chain, stretching from transmission, you know, distribution, and you know, generation. And so there's been quite a lot of this going on, and no wonder we've had conversations around unbundling and unbundling ESCOM, et cetera, et cetera. But these are more complex conversations, you know, that, you know, can go on and on and on. But bottom line is, a lot of these conversations that have to do with unbundling or increasing private sector participation in the power sector all revolve around regulation and how, you know, IPPs need to behave. And because at the end of the day, you've got a certain energy mix, and you need, everything needs to fit in, because at the end of the day, you realize that the power sector will transform in a way that it will no longer be vertically integrated. It's going to become a web. You know, the power sector is going to become like telecommunication. Now telecommunication has developed, but all of this needs to sit in a certain kind of system where it's all interconnected. Yeah. Great, thank you. I think happy to take another question. Great. I think I'm not sure if there are any questions, you know, on the Zoom, but we can always, you know, respond to them a little later, or perhaps, you know, with a follow-up on a wrap-up of this conversation. But I'd like to start by thanking Pa Usman and David for taking time to, you know, join this event. I know you've got very busy schedules and heading to other events now, so I'd like to thank you very much for taking time to contribute to this discussion. And for our viewers joining us virtually, thank you very much for joining the discussion. And for those that are here in person, thanks again for joining the discussion, and have a lovely day. Thank you.